Welcome to the Myth and Magic Authors Podcast, folklore and fantasy topics aimed at creative storytellers. To write stories and challenge your brain with exciting ideas, delve into these presentations and reflections. See how fantasy realms are based on actual world history, legend, and lore. Study fairy tales, nature fables, and supernaturalism to engage in a jumble of concepts that will trigger your fancy and get you writing imaginatively. Now, here's your host, Neil Mack.
Hello, fantasy fiction fans and fantasy creatives everywhere, and welcome to Myth and Magic. This week I want to ask two lots of questions. The first question I want to talk about is what is hard fantasy? And also want to turn my attention to the great eagle problem in fantasy fiction narratives. But I'm also going to ask another question which has come up this week, and that is, why are most people not creative? And if they're not creative, then what's up with me? Why am I like this? Why am I wired differently to most people? But let's first talk about hard fantasy. Now, if you've ever attempted to create a system of magic for your books, you'll quickly acknowledge, I think, that the conventional wisdom is that magical processes have consequences. Because, after all, magic is a natural mechanism, isn't it? We're familiar with natural mechanisms because of our knowledge of physics. So, for example, in physics, energy is the property that must be transferred to a body or a physical system to perform any work or any function. And we recognise that energy is a conserved quantity, so that means that energy can be converted into a different form, but it cannot be created and it cannot be destroyed. And we recognise there's different types of energy. For example, there's gravitational energy, electrical energy, magnetic energy. There's elastic energy that's stored within springy objects like bows and coiled springs. There's chemical energy, which is released when fuel burns. There's radiant energy, which is carried by light. And there's thermal energy, which is created by an object's temperature. And we're also aware, aren't we, that living organisms require energy to stay alive. So, with all those things in mind, if magic is to exist, then it must essentially be powered by some type of exotic energy. And so we might describe hard fantasy as magic that is self-consistent in the same way that science is self-consistent. In other words, hard fantasy is logical and it's reproducible. And it's even intuitively or perhaps intellectually comprehensible. This means for the reader, the system of magic that you're using will be more convincing and more persuasive than any whimsical or capricious magic that you've come up with. Now, if you hadn't guessed it already, the great eagle problem refers to the presence of a powerful and magical set of eagles in J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth, which is a fictional universe that he scrupulously and meticulously observed and he depicted, and yet, this is the key thing, he contrived to introduce a set of flying and talking creatures into the plot that would solve an impossible predicament in the storytelling that he himself set up. In order to get an idea of what I mean by the great eagle problem, I'd like you to think about another type of fiction, Wild Westerns. In a Wild West story, imagine that your protagonist has painstakingly and diligently collected a group of other talents, maybe 6 of them, and this magnificent 7 has organised and they've prepared and they've rehearsed for a giant showdown with a ruthless antagonist. But all their preparations amount to nothing in the final denouement of the chapter, because just as they're getting into position, the cavalry arrives just in the nick of time and the cavalry saves the day. Now imagine if you wrote that into your storyline, your readers, I think, will feel cheated. And they'll feel cheated because it's basically shortchanging them. Some will say that the cavalry charge, a bit like J.R.R. Tolkien's Eagles, are a relinquishment of the rules of that narrative's internal logic. Thus, the Eagles stroke the cavalry cheapen and disennoble the entire world that had been, until that point, systematically created. And the worst accusation that a reader can make is that an author who is tempted to use the great eagle idea exposes the weakness of an entire system, meaning, in essence, that the narrative has been a complete waste of time for the reader. So hard fantasy writers can be defined as those authors who have observed the unsatisfactoriness that they've seen in other works, and so they're very heedful, they're extra heedful in their approach to them building magical systems, remembering that those systems will be natural mechanisms and therefore they will have consequences. And if hard fantasy authors are guided by extreme care and they take great effort to make sure that their magical systems are intuitively and intellectually comprehensible to the reader, then hard fantasy writers will not create the same kind of annoying predicament or the annoying situation where the only solution for a favourable outcome in their final reckoning is a great eagle solution or a cavalry charge solution. I was going to tell you the definition of eucatastrophe. eucatastrophe, eucatastrophe. It's a sudden, unexpected turn of events in the story which ensures that the protagonist does not meet some terrible, impending, though very plausible and very probable, doom. Now, amazingly, J.R.R. Tolkien did come up with this word. It's a portmanteau, and it joins EU, which means good in ancient Greek, with catastrophe, which in its original sense, in the original sense of the word, means the final resolution of a plot or idea, or we sometimes call this the denouement. So it's a word that describes impossible problems in a plot that have been suddenly and implausibly resolved. So in fairy tales, we might describe unlikely happy endings, for example, the happily ever after endings, as eucatastrophes. And we might expect the hero to triumph over all enemies. But how likely are either of those scenarios? For example, consider this. If two lovers lived happily ever after, did it mean that they died together on the same day? I used to ask myself that when I was a boy in shorts reading fairy stories. When that last bit comes, they lived happily ever after, does that mean that they lived eternally? Or does it mean they both died on the same day? And if a hero triumphed over all enemies, did that mean that the hero exterminated the entire human race to achieve such an unequivocal result? So eucatastrophes are just as unconvincing as great eagles, I would suggest, and therefore they should be avoided. So let me know if you've uncovered a really obvious great eagle or a really obvious eucatastrophe in any fantasy titles you've recently read. And also let me know if you've got any tips you'd like to share about creating logical and reproducible and comprehensible systems of magic. I'd like to know those, so share them please on Twitter at Neilmach, Neilmach, all one word. So I said that at the start that I wanted to talk about creativity, but I'll ask a specific question, that is, why are some people creative but most people are not? And if some people are creative and most are not, then what's wrong with me? Why am I like this? Why am I wired to be creative? And this thought process started for me this week because as part of my other life as a journalist, I reported on the wanton destruction of a priceless and an irreplaceable work of art here in my hometown of Staines in Surrey, England. It's a world famous piece of work, and it was created by a world famous artist, and it represents some deities, they are nymphs, dancing in a jet of water. The sculptor who worked on this worked in forged steel and bronze, so it was a pretty heavyweight piece of metalwork. It seems, from what I can find out, that vandals came in the night and they not only tore the statue down, but they also ripped it into pieces. And after I wrote my report, many of the local residents who read my report asked, "What's wrong with people these days?" and "Why do people hate art so much?" I was annoyed, of course, but if I took a step back, what was interesting about this criminal damage to the Five Swimmers statue, that's what it's called, the Five Swimmers, was that it was not indiscriminate vandalism. Not really. Because when you look at the damage that was caused, you must assume that several sturdy people must have been involved in the damage. And they presumably brought tools and equipment with them, because at least one figure had been decapitated. And it must have taken a while, perhaps a long while, to complete destruction on this level. So I think this was a planned act of desecration, and it took preparation, and I think it took a level of strategizing to complete. So you've got to ask yourself, why did people go out of their way to do this? Is it because they took pleasure in tearing the thing down? And I think the answer is yes. I think they might feel a reward, or they feel some sense of gratification. Maybe it's stimulating, because they must have done to be bothered to go to all of that effort to destroy something so beautiful. I also thought about this. If they did that kind of damage to an unyielding and weighty clump of ironmongery, then what would they have done if they could get their fingers around the skinny neck of the weedy human who had created it? I'm filled with apprehension just thinking about that. When I discussed the damage with my wife and I showed her the photographs I'd taken, my wife, who's an enthusiastic crafter, asked me why successive local governments had closed down art studios, they'd shut down adult learning centres, the kind of centre that would have offered creative arts such as pottery, weaving and writing and landscape painting, and they'd also shut down our only art centre, and funny enough the building is adjoining the now ruined sculpture, although it's been sold to developers for a tidy profit. And the town council has also shut down the area's only adult education building and the only art studio. And these remarks that my wife made reminded me that the Her Majesty's government and the Chancellor of Her Majesty's government, Rishi Sunak, suggested that musicians and artists should retrain and they should find new employment if the pandemic hit them back in 2020. And while this remark was criticised by many artists, most commentators and the louder chatterers online took a view that his words were more or less correct, and they showed general agreement with his position. So we saw headlines in the papers such as, and I quote, "Love is fury over Rishi Sunak suggesting they retrain, like everyone else, if they lose their jobs." And that was the headline on Daily Mail, 6th of October 2020. However, artistic and cultural activities helped people, didn't they, overcome the pandemic. And arts and culture brings money and opportunity and trade and visitors to Britain. That's what brings people to Britain, culture. And art contributes about £10 billion a year to the UK economy. Plus, as Ian Rankin, the author, once said, without the arts, our lives are impoverished. So why are creative people so ridiculed? Well, my theory is that the human brain has evolved to be non-creative. I believe that the human brain has a great capacity to form and recognise patterns, and it works with those patterns to make sense of the universe around it. Repetition and routines constitute the bulk of human behaviour, so those are the activities that a regular human brain takes the most seriously. But there are other reasons why most people are not creative and why most people are suspicious of creative people. So when I put my mind to it, I came up with a list, and here's my list. Number 1, we do not teach people creative skills, and we only test them for their ability to work on repetitions and routines. And people are not supported, they're not given the time and space to practice their creativity. And society thinks creativity is bad because it's a waste of time. And society thinks creativity is bad because there's already a perfectly good way of doing things, and so any new thinking goes against the grain. And we do not push people to be unique. In fact, society pushes against originality of thought. And people are prevented from thinking outside the box or being innovative because exploring ideas is deemed to be a waste of somebody else's valuable time. And society punishes creative people. Just think of all the starving artists and all the struggling poets. Society keeps those type of people downtrodden and in poverty. And society considers creatives to be sponges who feed on the labours of the majority. And if someone you know, a parent, a teacher, or even a friend, is gifted, they might dumb down or conceal their creative instincts for fear of not being accepted by the general society or by their peers. And creativity equals individuality, and that's bad, because any distinctions, or if you want to describe it as differences, are frowned upon by a society that values conformity over individualism. And society often views creativity as being insubordinate. Regimes think that artists engage in derogatory behaviour or they promote subversive attitudes. Just think of all the artists and the writers who've been jailed. And some see creativity as a kind of unwelcome permissiveness. And this is why artists and art can't be countenanced in any morally religious or strict puritanical culture. So think of the Taliban who have banned music. And creativity is identified, in some minds at least, with bohemianism. And bohemianism have buzzwords: hippie, beatnik, gypsy, layabout. So there's a stigma and there's bigotry involved. And creativity is associated, in some people's minds anyway, with exoticism and other non-native strangeness. And so there's stigma and there's intolerance in those thoughts too. And derogatory terms such as love is, that was used in the Daily Mail headline, suggest that a creative person is affected or is uncommonly prone to emotional behaviour, and such jibes perpetuate stereotypes about creative people, and they drive people away from trying out creative pursuits for themselves. And there's a suggestion that creative people are unduly romantic types. For example, they're impractical, or they're sentimental, or they're sensualistic. Other homophobic innuendos are employed that are not quite insults, but are nevertheless meant to be taken as aspersions. So once again, being called a lovey. I remember a friend of mine said to me once, "You're an arty-farty type. What work of art has an artist ever given society? What sensible, true, practical work of art has an artist ever given to society? Don't they just shilly-shally about?" So I said to him, "Well, what do you do? Do you not read books or watch television?" "No, I've never read a book," he said. "I watch some television. Most of the time I watch sport on television." So I said, "Well, the stadium in which the sport is played was created by an architect. That architect is a creative person, an artist. Do you play computer games?" Yeah, I play some computer games sometimes, normally shoot 'em ups." Well, they're created by artists. And my final on my list is we structure some modern societies to maintain the power of wealthy elites and of huge corporations. Therefore, these societies value consumers, the consumers of the products they sell, over the creators and the artisans, i.e. the people who are not shackled by traded consumer goods. One last thought about human creativity that I wanted to share with you is this. In 1968, George Land and Dr. Beth Jarman developed a test to identify the capacity for divergent thinking and creativity in humans. They found through their experiments that 98% of children aged 3 to 5 were remarkably creative. In fact, practically all of those children reached genius level in creativity. But the figure dropped to 12% amongst 15-year-olds. Why? Land and Jarman administered the exact same test to 280,000 adults aged 31 years. Guess what happened? The adults achieved only 2% on the creativity index. So they supposed that by the age of 30, most adults were not creative at all. The conclusion must be that most children are creative before they begin any formal education, but their natural creative impulses are educated out of them by a society that requires them to become workers and consumers. And the consequence of this is that creativity is regarded by the general adult population anyway as childish, as trivial, and as infantile. So there's a consensus among the public that creatives need to grow up. And I think that was the gist of the Daily Mail headline. So creatives need to stop being so babyish. They need to grow up and be like everyone else. Be a consumer and be a worker. So what are your thoughts on that subject? Let me know via Twitter @NeilMach, NeilMach. And I'm looking forward to you next week, where I'm going to be speaking to a guest. So it's going to be a guest interview. Keep following Myth and Magic, the fantasy fiction authors podcast. See you soon. Bye.